All right. Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at something that's been quietly revolutionizing the way we experience the web.
We are.
It's a little something called asynchronous rendering in React.
That's right.
Have you heard of it?
Oh, yeah. It's pretty fundamental these days. I mean, we're talking about the difference between a website that just feels like it's constantly catching up,
Yeah.
and one that's just buttery smooth and responsive, even when it's juggling tons and tons of data.
Like a website that doesn't make you want to tear your hair out.
Exactly.
So we're going to be diving into that today. We have a bunch of really interesting articles, blog posts, some documentation.
Absolutely.
And yeah, just really trying to break down what asynchronous rendering is, why it matters, and how it's changing the game for developers and users alike.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about this whole thing is this idea of perception and how it plays into the user experience.
Hmm?
It's really all about how we can make applications feel faster and more seamless, even if the actual loading times haven't changed drastically.
Okay, so it's almost like you're tricking our brains into having a better experience.
In a way, yeah. I mean, you're not really tricking the brain, you're just making it so that things happen when the brain expects them to happen,
How about that?
instead of having to wait for everything to be ready and then it all kind of clunks into place at once.
Right. So where do we even start?
Well, I think it's helpful to understand how rendering has traditionally worked.
Okay.
We're talking about synchronous rendering, which is essentially like a one-lane road where every task has to wait its turn. And so if one task is taking a really long time, everything gets backed up.
Oh, so that's what causes that awful freezing effect that we all know and hate.
Exactly. And this gets even worse with complex applications where you're dealing with a lot of data, images, all these different components that need to be rendered on the screen.
Yeah, it's like rush hour traffic on your website.
Exactly. And nobody likes to be stuck in traffic.
Okay, so synchronous rendering, not so great.
Yeah.
But how does asynchronous rendering fix that? It's not like we can just magically make data appear instantly, can we?
Well, you're right. We can't break the laws of physics or anything like that.
Darn.
But what we can do is make the app feel like it's not waiting. You see, asynchronous rendering allows React to handle these different tasks in the background without blocking the main thread.
Okay.
It's like having those multiple lanes of traffic that you were talking about.
Okay, I'm starting to get the picture. So while some parts of the app are still loading, other parts can keep running. And that's where suspense comes in.
Precisely. Suspense, you can think of it as a really smart traffic manager, right?
Okay.
It's there for your components. It essentially allows them to pause their rendering while they're waiting for something. Maybe it's data coming from an API, or maybe it's some large piece of code to load. And that prevents the entire app from freezing and gives developers a really nice way to show a loading indicator or even some placeholder content while the user waits.
So it's almost like those smooth loading animations that we see now in all the modern apps.
Exactly, yeah. It makes the whole waiting experience feel a lot more intentional.
Yeah, it's like, okay, something's happening. I get it. Instead of just, hello? Is anything working?
You got it.
So we're not just throwing up our hands and being like, computer's broken.
Exactly.
We're like, okay, this is supposed to be happening. I see a cool little loading thing. Everything's fine.
Yeah, and the cool thing is that this is all managed pretty elegantly behind the scenes with this suspense component. But it's not just about the suspense component itself. There are a few important hooks that come into play here, and our notes mention these.
Yeah, they do.
Use state and use transition.
Oh, yeah, those are good ones.
So, with use state, that's super crucial for managing the state of that data that's being loaded. It lets you keep track of whether the data is still loading or whether it's loaded successfully, or maybe there's been an error.
Hmm.
And then we have use transition, which is kind of like that fine-tuning knob,
Okay.
where you get to control the priority of different updates. For example, if you're typing something in a search bar, you want that input to feel instant,
Oh,
even if there's a huge data fetch happening in the background.
Yeah.
And so with use transition, you can tell React, hey, this search input is super important. Make sure you prioritize that.
Don't make me wait.
Exactly. Render those changes right away, even if the less important data is still loading in the background.
Okay, so it's almost like you're telling React what matters to the user in the moment.
Exactly. Yeah. You're giving it that context so it can make the right decisions about what to prioritize.
Okay, so we kind of have the building blocks here.
Yeah.
But where does this actually all come together? Like, where does suspense really shine in real-world applications?
Well, one of the most common and impactful use cases is fetching data from an API.
Okay.
Because instead of the app locking up while it waits for that data, Suspense allows you to show this really smooth loading state.
Right.
And then once the data is ready, seamlessly transition to displaying it. No more of those jarring jumps or the frozen screen.
Right.
Just a really elegant flow.
Seamless, almost like magic.
Like magic,
But
exactly.
you know what else is magical, or at least seems like magic? Code splitting.
Ah.
And our sources mentioned that Suspense really comes in handy there too.
Oh, absolutely. When you're building larger applications, loading all of the code at once can be a huge bottleneck.
Yeah.
And so Suspense allows you to split that code into smaller chunks that are loaded only when they're needed. It's like having smart delivery, but for code, right?
It is.
Yeah.
So you only load what you need when you need it. But speaking of loading and performance, things get really interesting when we start talking about concurrent mode.
Yeah, concurrent mode.
Concurrent mode.
This takes everything we've talked about so far, like asynchronous rendering, Suspense, everything, and kind of dials it up to 11.
Okay.
And it does this by being built on top of this super cool foundation called Fiber. Now, Fiber is kind of like rewriting the engine of React to be more interruptible, more flexible.
Wait, hold on. Can you maybe unpack Fiber for a second? Because I feel like that's a pretty important piece of the puzzle here.
Oh, totally. So imagine Fiber as breaking down a large task into a bunch of smaller, more manageable pieces. This allows React to work on those pieces in little bursts without having to block that main thread for super long periods.
Right.
And this is what allows for features like incremental rendering, where updates can kind of happen gradually instead of all at once.
So instead of, like repainting an entire picture every single time something changes, it just touches up the parts that need updating.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
Okay. I get it.
And so concurrent mode takes full advantage of this by being able to start rendering updates even before the data is fully available.
Mm-hmm.
It can also use time slicing to interrupt tasks that are taking too long and prioritize things that are more urgent, like responding to user input. So it's super efficient.
Okay, so it's like having this incredibly efficient project manager inside of React,
Yeah.
just making sure everything runs smoothly and nothing gets left behind.
Exactly. It's about making sure that the user always feels like the app is one step ahead, anticipating their needs and responding with that elegance and speed.
But with all this power, I imagine there's also responsibility.
Oh, for sure.
Like there must be some performance considerations that we need to keep in mind.
Absolutely. It's not a magic bullet.
Okay.
You still need to write efficient code and think carefully about how you're using these different features. So things like memoization and caching, they become even more important with Suspense and concurrent mode because you want to optimize those Suspense dependencies.
Right.
And prevent any unnecessary re-renders. And so, memorization is basically just remembering the results of expensive calculations so you don't have to do them over and over again.
Yeah.
And then caching is just about storing frequently accessed data so that it can be retrieved quickly.
Right. The good old classic.
Exactly. Tried and true performance tips.
But don't forget about our friend use transition.
Oh, yes.
We've got to give him some love too.
Right. So by using use transition carefully, you can make sure those high priority updates like that user input that we were talking about earlier are handled right away while other things happen in the background.
Right.
And that's going to keep the whole user experience nice and smooth.
So it's almost like finding that sweet spot between harnessing all this power of asynchronous rendering in concurrent mode, but also making sure that you're not overloading the system.
I think that's a great way to put it.
All right, well, we've covered a lot of ground today. From the kind of clunky limitations of synchronous rendering to the elegance of Suspense and the raw power of concurrent mode.
Yeah.
I think it's safe to say that asynchronous rendering is not just some passing trend. This is a fundamental shift in the way we think about building web applications.
Totally. And I think what makes it even more exciting is that this is just the beginning.
Uh-huh.
Front-end technologies are constantly evolving, and I'm really curious to see what other innovative approaches emerge as we continue to explore this idea of how we can create the best possible user experiences.
It really makes you wonder what the future holds. I mean,
Yeah.
will we reach a point where the line between loading and interacting just becomes completely invisible? It's something to think about. But hey, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive.
It is.
Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Yeah, thanks.
And until next time, keep exploring and keep diving deep.
We'll see.